Before the orders came, before the drums sounded reveille, before anyone dared whisper that we were finally moving toward the enemy, the world lay in a silence so complete it felt unnatural, like something sacred was about to be broken. I remember waking before the others, stirred not by noise but by the absence of it. For a moment I thought I'd gone deaf. The usual sounds of camp, snoring men, murmuring fires, restless horses shifting in their lines, had faded into something distant and muted. A low fog crawled across the ground, turning our rows of tents into pale shapes drifting in a white sea. The air was cold enough to sting the inside of my nose when I breathed in. I sat up slowly, careful not to disturb the canvas above me, as though even that small sound might shatter the stillness. My fingers brushed the wooden stock of my rifle out of instinct. It was always there, even in sleep, the weight of it, the responsibility of it. A constant reminder of why I was far from home. Outside, the sky hovered in that faint shade between night and dawn, when the stars dimmed but refused to disappear. The horizon glowed with the softest touch of blue, as delicate as breath on glass. A few clouds drifted overhead, thin and wispy, as though the sky hadn't yet decided whether the day would be gentle or cruel. I stepped out onto the dew-soaked grass. The scent of wet earth rose to meet me, fresh, clean, almost comforting. For a brief moment, I could almost forget the reason we were here. The war felt distant, like a nightmare fading under morning light. But then the silence settled again. Heavy. Unnatural. The kind of silence that comes before a storm. Campfires burned low, their last embers glowing like buried coals. Smoke curled lazily upward, barely moving in the still air. I walked between the tents, boots leaving soft impressions in the ground. Everywhere I looked, there were still forms, men wrapped in army blankets, faces peaceful in sleep, unaware of what the day would bring. Part of me envied them. Another part pitied them. None of us were ready. A whippoorwill called faintly from the tree-line, a lonely sound that echoed across the fields. Somewhere beyond the fog, I heard a creek trickling over stones. The water's movement was steady, indifferent to the chaos swelling all around us. Nature didn't care that the nation was tearing itself apart. The earth would keep spinning. The grass would keep growing. The river would continue its slow journey to the sea, carrying on as if men weren't gearing up to spill each other's blood. I walked toward the edge of camp, past the horses tied to picket posts. Their breath rose in warm clouds, ears flicking as they sensed my approach. They were restless, more restless than we were, even. Animals knew things before men did. They felt danger as a pressure in the air, a tremor in the soil. As I reached the ridge overlooking the valley, the landscape stretched out before me in shades of blue and silver. Hills rolled like frozen waves. Farmland lay quiet, fences dark and damp with dew. In the distance, the faint outline of Washington hovered under the fading moon. I could see the Capitol dome from here, still unfinished, wrapped in scaffolding that glistened faintly as the returning light touched it. Even at this distance it looked fragile, as though one strong wind could topple it. Some said the unfinished dome was a bad omen, that the country wouldn't be whole again until the dome was complete. I didn't know if that was true. But standing there, with the dawn creeping over the horizon, it seemed fitting. We were all unfinished. The nation. The army. Me. A chill breeze drifted over the ridge, lifting the hair from my forehead. It carried with it a faint scent, smoke, distant and sharp. Not wood smoke. Something harsher. A reminder that the Confederates were out there, somewhere beyond those hills, preparing just as we were. My heartbeat quickened. Behind me, the camp began to stir. A few voices rose, groggy and confused. Someone yawned. Someone else cursed quietly as they stumbled over a tent rope. Then the first drum sounded, a single, slow beat rolling through the fog like thunder in the distance. A shiver ran through me. Not fear, exactly. Something deeper. The beat came again. And again. Then it grew into a steady rhythm, calling the men from their blankets, pulling them toward formation. The camp transformed with startling speed. Tents flapped as men pushed their way out, rubbing sleep from their eyes. The fog swirled around their legs as if reluctant to release them. Officers strode between companies, their voices sharp. Fall in! Get your things packed! Move with purpose, men! Have your gear ready! Step lively now! I watched it all from the ridge, feeling the gravity of the moment settle over me like a weight on my shoulders. This wasn't like the drills. This wasn't like the rumor-filled days of waiting. This was real. The march was coming. I clenched my jaw and breathed in the cold morning air, trying to steady myself. A strange mixture of pride and dread churned in my chest. Pride, because we were answering the nation's call. Dread, because none of us truly knew what awaited us out there on the road to Manassas. Footsteps approached from behind. It was Corporal Hensley, his face still half-shadowed by the dim light. He looked older than he had the day before, eyes tired, mouth set in a thin line. "You're up early," he muttered as he came to stand beside me. "Couldn't sleep," I answered. "None of us can," he said quietly. "Not really." We stood in silence for a moment, staring across the pale valley. The sun began to lift, brushing the fog with hints of gold. The landscape brightened slowly, as if reluctant to reveal itself. I could feel the warmth coming, but it hadn't reached us yet. "You think we're ready?" I asked. He let out a breath, not quite a laugh. "Does it matter?" No. It didn't. Because ready or not, we were going. When the bugle finally sounded, sharp and ringing through the cool air, the last remnants of the quiet night vanished. The camp came alive, shouts, clattering tin cups, boots stomping, rifles slinging over shoulders. The fog thinned as the sun broke free of the horizon. I picked up my rifle, feeling the familiar weight settle into my hands. The wood was cold. The barrel gleamed faintly, catching the morning light. For a moment, I looked back at Washington, its buildings pale in the distance, its streets still asleep. I wondered how many would look out from porches and windows today, searching for news of us. Hoping. Praying. Then I turned toward the rising. When the order finally came down, the march toward Manassas, the air in camp seemed to change all at once, as if even the wind understood that nothing would ever be the same again. For weeks we had drilled under the hot July sun, sweat stinging our eyes, our uniforms clinging to us as though they feared we might escape. Washington buzzed with the confidence of a country that believed victory was inevitable, and that we, raw volunteers and farm boys, would simply stroll down to Richmond and end the rebellion before the leaves turned. But standing there in the early morning light, gear strapped tight across my aching shoulders, I didn't feel invincible. I felt suspended. Held between the life I had known and the one waiting for me somewhere beyond the Potomac. The sun had just begun to rise, spilling gold over the eastern sky, when we formed into our columns. Dust rose in soft clouds beneath our feet, catching the light like powdered amber. The air smelled of trampled grass, horse sweat, and damp canvas from the tents still being packed away. Officers shouted instructions, their voices cracking with urgency, but to my ears they sounded far away, muffled by the thump of my own pulse. Around me, the men moved with a kind of buzzing energy, half excitement, half dread. Some cracked jokes to hide trembling hands. Some sang softly under their breath, trying to steady themselves. Others stared into the distance, lips tight, eyes hollow, like they'd already seen something the rest of us hadn't. I kept checking and rechecking my gear, cartridge box secured, canteen filled, haversack packed with hardtack and whatever scraps the quartermaster had handed out overnight. My fingers fumbled more than once, and I cursed myself for it. I didn't want anyone thinking I was afraid. But the truth was, I was terrified, of the unknown more than anything. Of what waited beyond the horizon. Of what this war might demand of me. General McDowell rode past us, his horse kicking up dust that clung to his blue uniform. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. His expression was carved from stone. He had the look of a man who understood the weight of every life marching behind him, and the weight of every mistake he might make. Rumor had it he didn't believe we were ready for battle. And if that was true, then the dark circles under his eyes made perfect sense. We stepped forward as the drums beat the pace, the steady rhythm echoing across the open fields. 1-2, 1-2. Boots struck the earth like a heartbeat, thousands of men moving in unison, a living machine of flesh and hope and bravado. As we marched through the outskirts of Washington, civilians lined the roads. Some cheered until their voices cracked. Others waved flags or threw flowers at us as if we were already victorious. Women dabbed their eyes with handkerchiefs, though many forced smiles, pretending they weren't imagining their sons and husbands lying somewhere far from home. Children ran beside us for a while, shouting encouragement, but even their laughter felt strained. A few old men removed their hats as we passed, their faces solemn. They had the look of people who'd lived long enough to know the real price of war, and who understood that these parading boys might not return. One woman pressed a folded note into my hand as I marched by. "For luck," she whispered. I didn't open it until later, but even then I didn't recognize the handwriting. It was just a prayer. A stranger's desperate plea to God to spare one more soldier. The buildings thinned as we continued southward. Washington faded behind us, the unfinished Capitol dome still wrapped in scaffolding that glowed pale in the rising sunlight. The farther we walked, the quieter the cheering became, until there was nothing but the shuffling of boots and the creak of wagon wheels behind us. We left the paved roads for dirt paths lined with sprawling farmland. Wheat fields rippled in the breeze like waves of gold. Fences crooked with age marked the edges of pastures dotted with grazing cattle. Here and there smoke rose from chimneys of distant farmhouses, the scent mingling with the sweet smell of freshly cut hay. For a while, it was beautiful. Peaceful, even. Too peaceful. I kept expecting something to break that silence. A gunshot, a distant cannon, a rebel scout sighting. But the countryside seemed to sleep beneath the warmth of early morning, unaware of, or indifferent to, the thousands of soldiers marching across its quiet paths. By midday, the sun blazed overhead, baking the earth beneath our feet. The air turned heavy, thick with dust kicked up by the columns ahead of us. Men loosened their collars, wiped sweat from their brows, and cursed the weight of their packs. Some stumbled, and a few fell out of line to drink from streams running parallel to the road. The heat shimmered off the fields, turning the horizon into a wavering mirage. The road wound endlessly ahead, disappearing over gentle hills that promised rest but never delivered it. I felt my shoulders aching beneath the straps of my knapsack. My legs burned. My tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth despite careful sips from my canteen. But worse than the physical strain were the questions that gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. Would I freeze when the shooting started? Would I fire on another man and feel nothing? Would I even survive the first volley? Every time the questions surfaced, I forced them back down. Cowardice was a sickness that spread quickly among men. I refused to let it take hold. We halted briefly under the shade of a cluster of oak trees. I sank to the ground with the others, feeling the cool grass beneath my palms. The leaves whispered overhead, rustling softly in a wind that carried relief like a gentle hand across my face. It was then, as I stared at the patterns of sunlight dappling the ground, that it struck me, this might be the last quiet moment of my life. The thought chilled me more than any morning fog. When we resumed the march, the landscape shifted again, the fields giving way to dense patches of forest. Tall pines rose around us like pillars of some ancient cathedral, their needles carpeting the ground in muted greens. The shade offered relief, but the woods also swallowed sound, making every snapped twig or distant rustle feel ominous. Somewhere far ahead, a single cannon sounded, dull, distant, like a fist slamming into the earth. The column stiffened. Conversations died mid-sentence. My skin prickled. It was beginning. The world ahead was changing. And with each step we took, I felt something tightening inside me, anticipation, fear, duty, all tangled together. We were marching toward our first battle. Toward Bull Run. Toward whatever fate waited for us in the smoke and confusion of war. And though I kept my head high and my pace steady, a single truth pressed itself. By the second day of the march, the rhythm of movement had carved itself into my bones. My feet no longer felt like part of my body. They were simply two weights swinging forward because they had to. Each step carried a dull ache, and each mile blurred into the next, but somehow the column pressed on without complaint. The constant beat of the drums, the barked orders of officers, and the occasional bray of pack mules formed a kind of marching anthem that kept us going even when every muscle begged for rest. Morning came slowly, a pale wash of gray light spreading over the encampment as though the sun itself hesitated to rise. We had slept on the ground, our blankets thin against the cold that crept in once darkness fell. I woke with dew clinging to my uniform and a stiffness in my joints that made standing feel like dragging myself up from a grave. The air smelled of wet earth and smoldering embers from the campfires that had burned low during the night. Coffee, if one could call the bitter, scorched liquid, coffee, was passed around in tin cups. I held mine between my palms like a sacred relic, letting the warmth seep into my fingers. Around me, the men stirred slowly, some rubbing sleep from their eyes, others adjusting bandages on blisters that had formed overnight. A few stared off into the trees, lost in whatever thoughts visited them at dawn: home, fear, memories of family they might never see again. "Another 10 miles today," Corporal Hanley muttered beside me, stretching his back with a pained groan. "How do you know?" I asked. "Because they told us 5 yesterday and it turned out to be 15. I'm learning to read their lies." I cracked a smile despite myself. Humor had become our only defense, thin armor against the growing dread we tried so hard to ignore. We formed the line once more, our ranks ragged from fatigue. The air remained cool for the first hour, offering a brief grace, but soon the sun climbed higher, turning the dirt road into a trail of rising dust. Every exhale tasted like grit. Every breath brought the scent of horses, sweat, and the leather of worn equipment. My uniform, stiff from yesterday's march, clung to me like a weight I couldn't shed. The scenery changed as we moved deeper into Virginia. Farmland stretched endlessly on either side of the road, dotted with barns and whitewashed houses that looked almost too peaceful, too fragile. The rebellion had not yet scarred this part of the land. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys. Cows grazed behind split-rail fences. A few curious villagers stood at a distance, watching us with expressions I couldn't read: fear, defiance, hope, or perhaps a mix of all three. One old man leaned on a cane near the edge of his property, his gray beard swaying in the breeze. He didn't smile or frown. He simply watched us march past, eyes sharp, taking in every detail of our uniforms and numbers. I wondered whether he had sons in the Confederate ranks, or if he was simply counting how many of us might not survive what lay ahead. As the hours wore on, the heat grew unbearable. Men marched with their mouths half open, drawing in air as though they were drowning. More than once, soldiers fell out of line to gulp water from streams or ditches. Officers shouted at them to return. Some obeyed, some didn't. Exhaustion makes disobedience taste sweet. By midday, the road narrowed and the forest pressed close. Tall pines cast long shadows across our path, the canopy above filtering the sunlight into fractured beams that danced across the ground. The sharp scent of sap and pine needles filled the air. The woods offered shade, but also silence, thick, restless silence that made every noise feel too loud. Branches snapped somewhere deeper among the trees. My hand instinctively brushed my rifle. "It's just deer," Sergeant Rose said behind me, though his voice wavered. No one believed him completely. We had been warned that Confederate scouts might lurk in these forests. The thought made the hairs along my arms rise. Every shadow looked like a man aiming a musket. Every rustle sounded like a rifle being cocked. The tension spread through the ranks like smoke. Conversations died. Boots softened their thud. Men began to glance at each other, checking to confirm that fear wasn't theirs alone. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. By late afternoon, the column halted near a clearing where a trickling stream wound its way between moss-covered stones. The officers allowed us a short rest, though rest, in this war, seemed to mean collapse wherever you stand. I dropped beside a tree, leaning my back against its rough bark. My canteen was nearly empty. I filled it cautiously from the stream, watching the water swirl around my hand. Nearby, 2 soldiers argued about how close we were to the enemy. One swore he saw smoke rising from a rebel encampment earlier that morning. Another claimed scouts had reported Confederates only a few miles ahead. Rumors ran wild, faster than truth ever could. By now, every shadow felt like an advancing army. I took out the letter I'd received from my sister before we left Washington. The edges were soft from being opened so many times. She had written about the harvest, about how the corn was growing tall, and how Father's hands were stiffening too early this year. She told me that Mother prayed for me every night by the window, watching the moon rise as if it held the answer to whether I'd return home. I read the words again and again, until the guilt in my chest grew too heavy. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into my coat. The order to move came sooner than we wanted. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold that somehow felt ominous, like the horizon itself was bleeding. We marched into the evening, the air cooling around us, though our bodies still radiated the heat of the long day. Night approached slowly. The woods grew darker, shadows stretching long and thin across our path. The moon rose, pale, distant, watchful. A lantern bobbed here and there among the ranks, casting shaky halos of light that made the forest look alive. Men stumbled more often now. Some mumbled in frustration, others in delirious exhaustion. Still we marched. At last, we reached another clearing designated for our camp. The field sloped gently downward toward a creek, and the ground was soft enough to drive tent stakes. Fires sprang up like scattered stars, their glow illuminating tired faces, weary eyes, trembling hands. We ate our meager rations, hardtack softened in boiled water, a strip of salted pork, whatever we could find. No one spoke much. Exhaustion had stolen our words. As night settled over us, I lay back on my blanket and stared at the sky. The stars stretched endlessly above, cold and indifferent. Somewhere beyond the darkness lay Manassas. Somewhere beyond the stillness lay battle. The thought haunted me, a quiet specter at the edge of my mind. I closed my eyes, listening to the soft murmur of the creek, the crackling of distant campfires, and the quiet breathing of the men around me, strangers who had become brothers by necessity. Tomorrow, we would march again. Tomorrow, we would be closer still to the moment that would define us all. And as sleep finally dragged me under, one truth echoed in my mind. War was no longer a distant concept. It was a road. By the third morning, the road to Manassas felt less like a route and more like a slow tightening of fate around our throats. I woke before the bugle call, not from duty, but from the sharp, throbbing ache in my feet and the stiffness in my back. The ground had been unforgiving, a quilt of roots and rocks that dug into my spine all night. When I pushed myself upright, it felt like my bones had rusted. Dawn was still a rumor in the east, just a faint silver smudge behind the treetops. The air was cool enough to sting my lungs, carrying the smell of wet grass and the dying embers of last night's fires. Around me, the men stirred slowly. Some sat upright with blank, exhausted stares. Others struggled to their feet, wincing. A few continued sleeping despite the noise, men with the rare ability to collapse into unconsciousness wherever they fell. I envied them. Up, boys! Daylight's wasting. Sergeant Rowe barked, though daylight had yet to arrive. No one talked back. We were too tired for rebellion. I rose, slung my haversack over my shoulder, and tightened the straps of my rifle. My fingers trembled slightly, but not from cold. Each day that passed, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down heavier. The closer we drew to Bull Run, the louder the whispers grew, whispers of a fight unlike anything the country had seen in generations. Most men pretended not to hear those whispers. I pretended not to believe them. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was a piece of hardtack so tough I had to crack it against my knee. I dipped it into my canteen to soften it, then chewed slowly, tasting nothing but grit and the faint metallic tang of tin. Hunger dulled the complaint in my stomach, but not entirely. Jones sat beside me polishing his bayonet with the edge of his sleeve. He didn't look up as he spoke. "You think it'll happen today?" I didn't have to ask what he meant. "No," I said. "Tomorrow, maybe. Or the next." "Funny," he murmured. "We keep saying maybe, but the Rebs aren't marching backward, and neither are we." I didn't answer. I couldn't. Before we broke camp, I took a moment to look around. The forest was waking slowly. A thin layer of mist clung to the ground, drifting between the trees like ghostly fingers. Sunlight filtered through the branches in pale, cautious rays. For a moment, everything seemed too quiet. Then the bugle sounded, sharp and commanding, and the spell broke. We formed ranks and moved out. The road curved through rolling fields and sparse forest. My boots grew wet as we marched through patches of wildflowers and weeds. The air grew warmer, heavier, and soon the first beads of sweat gathered at my brow. By mid-morning, the pace had quickened. Officers urged us forward with sharper voices than usual. Something had them on edge. Rumors began drifting down the line. Confederate cavalry seen not far from here, scouts returning with news of troop movements, distant gunfire heard by the rear guard. None of these were confirmed. None of them needed to be. The road narrowed as it approached a ridge overlooking a wide valley. We halted at the crest, and for a moment the world spread out before us like a great, open canvas. Far below, the land dipped into a gentle basin, dotted with farmhouses and patches of forest. Smoke rose faintly from several points across the landscape, thin gray tendrils coiling into the sky. "Campfires," Lieutenant Parker said quietly beside me. "Or signal fires. Could be both," someone muttered behind us. A strange hush fell over the company. The realization settled in: the enemy wasn't miles away anymore. They were here, close enough that the scent of their fires drifted up to us on the breeze. We didn't linger long. The officers pushed us forward, down the slope and into the valley. The fields here felt different: darker soil, tall grass that seemed to sway nervously in the wind. The barns and houses we passed were eerily still. Some windows were shuttered tight, others stood open like empty eyes. An abandoned wagon lay overturned by the road, wheel cracked, axle snapped. A scattering of tools lay beside it, as though dropped in a hurry. Were leaves fingerprints long before the first shot? Around noon we stopped by a farmhouse that had been turned into a temporary supply depot. The yard was littered with barrels, crates, and discarded straps. Soldiers moved in and out carrying ammunition boxes and sacks of grain. The family that owned the house had clearly fled days ago. The porch swing rocked gently in the breeze, creaking rhythmically like a heartbeat. A few of us refilled our canteens at the well. The water was cold, sweet, better than anything I'd tasted in days. I drank deeply, letting the coolness spread through me. For a moment, it felt like a blessing. But the moment passed quickly. A courier rode in, dust rising behind his horse in a frantic cloud. He dismounted before the animal even stopped moving, sprinted toward the officers with a sealed letter in hand. We couldn't hear the words exchanged, but we didn't need to. The stiff posture of the officers, the grim set of their mouths, it told us enough. When we resumed marching, the pace was nearly double. The landscape shifted again: gentle hills, patches of woodland, winding streams that cut through the earth like veins. The afternoon sun glared down mercilessly, turning every button and buckle into a tiny fire. Sweat soaked through my shirt until it clung to my skin. I wasn't alone. Every man looked worn thin, faces flushed, breathing heavy. Hanley collapsed briefly and had to be helped to his feet. He waved off assistance with a forced laugh, but his eyes were dazed, unfocused. "Keep moving!" The sergeant's voice cracked through the air. "We stop when ordered, not when tired." Easy for him to say. As we marched, my thoughts drifted, not by choice, but by instinct. My mind kept circling back to home, the creek behind our farm where I used to fish in the evenings, the old sycamore tree whose branches reached so high I once believed they touched heaven, the smell of my mother's bread cooling on the windowsill after Sunday church. Those memories felt like another lifetime, another world, as distant as the stars. The sun dipped low, stretching long shadows across the road. The sky flared orange and pink, then slowly shifted to a deepening purple. Fireflies flickered to life among the tall grass. Despite the beauty of it all, a chill worked its way up my spine. Beauty often comes before storms. Just as twilight settled fully, we reached a wooded hilltop overlooking another valley, and there, faint but unmistakable, we saw them. Campfires. Tiny points of flame glowing against the darkening earth. "Rebs," someone whispered, voice trembling. My breath caught. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. This wasn't rumor anymore. This wasn't marching toward an idea. This was marching toward men, armed, ready, waiting. We were told to make camp in the woods, keeping fires small and voices low. As I spread my blanket over the ground, I could still see the Confederate fires flickering in the distance, like a constellation fallen to earth. I lay awake long after the others fell asleep, listening to the rustle of the trees and the distant hum of an enemy preparing for dawn. The march was over. The waiting had begun. And in the stillness of that night, I finally understood. Everything we had. Night settled over the woods like a heavy blanket, muffling every sound except those we carried inside ourselves. The fires we lit were small, mere glimmers tucked behind overturned crates or stones, to keep us hidden from the valley below. Even the officers' shadows moved quieter, as though afraid the Confederates might hear them breathing. I sat with my back against an oak tree, knees drawn up, my rifle across my lap. The bark dug into my spine with every breath, but I didn't shift. Any movement felt too loud for a night like this. Across the valley, the Confederate campfires flickered in the darkness. From where we were, they looked almost peaceful, like stars scattered across the earth. But every flicker meant a rifle, a cannon, a man ready to kill me come morning. The thought sat in my chest like a stone. Around me, the sounds of camp blended into a low, uneasy hum. Men murmured in small clusters. Some played cards silently, each movement stiff with tension. Others cleaned their muskets with mechanical focus, ramming rods down barrels and checking flints over and over again, as if the repetition alone could ward off fear. Jones sat near me, sharpening his bayonet against a smooth stone. The scrape, scrape, scrape cut through the still air like a warning. I finally broke the silence between us. "You planning to slice the whole rebel army yourself?" He grunted, kept sharpening. "Just making sure it's ready." "Sharp enough already." He paused, looked up. His eyes were dark in the firelight. "Maybe. But I ain't letting dull steel be the thing that gets me killed." I didn't argue. Not tonight. A few yards away, Private Hanley knelt by a scrap of paper, scribbling furiously by candlelight. He wrote with the desperation of a man carving words into stone rather than paper. A letter home. I recognized the look. I'd worn it myself the night before Fort Sumter. Some men prayed quietly, heads bowed, fingers intertwined. Others stared at nothing, faces blank, as if they'd slipped somewhere deep inside their minds. Only the young recruits, boys barely old enough to shave, spoke with any lightness at all. They whispered to each other about glory, about whipping the enemy in a single charge, about how they'd be back home by harvest. I envied their ignorance. I feared what it would cost. The woods smelled of damp earth and pine. A thin breeze rustled the leaves overhead, whispering through the branches. Every now and then, a twig snapped somewhere in the dark and half the camp turned in that direction, hands locking instinctively around their rifles. Even the horses were restless. They snorted and shifted, stamping the ground, ears flicking toward sounds only they could fully hear. As the hours dragged on, officers moved from squad to squad, checking gear, giving orders, delivering quiet reminders. Lieutenant Parker stopped in front of me. "You've checked your ammunition?" "Yes, sir." "And your caps?" "Dry and counted." He nodded, but his eyes lingered a moment too long. No words were exchanged, but the message was clear. "Get some sleep if you can. You'll need it." I couldn't. None of us could. The night felt stretched thin, fragile, like a thread pulled to the breaking point. I kept waiting for something to snap, a cannon blast, a warning shot, even a call from the pickets that the enemy was advancing. But nothing came. The silence became its own kind of torment. At one point, near midnight, Sergeant Rowe returned from the picket line with a report for the officers. When he passed me, I caught fragments of his whisper. "Movement down the slope, maybe repositioning artillery. They're readying for dawn. God help us when the sun rises." The words hit harder than any cannonball. I stood to clear my head, stepping carefully between sleeping bodies. The ground was soft underfoot, a mixture of soil and fallen pine needles. Somewhere nearby, water trickled through a shallow creek, its sound gentle and maddeningly calm. I followed the noise and found myself at the edge of the woods, overlooking the valley below. The Confederate fires still burned in scattered clusters, glowing faint orange against the dark earth. Smoke drifted up in thin, ghostly trails. Through the haze, I thought I could make out the dull shapes of tents, wagons, and men milling about. Even at this distance, the camp felt alive, an organism preparing itself for violence. My throat tightened. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once, twice, then went silent. I lowered myself onto a fallen log and watched the valley for a long while. Time lost its shape. The night grew colder. My breath misted faintly before me. My fingers grew numb, but I didn't unclench them from the rifle. A strange thought crept into my mind. Those men down there, they're waiting too. They're scared too. It didn't make them less dangerous, but it made them human. I wondered if any of them were staring back toward our side, imagining me the way I imagined them. I wondered if some Confederate mother prayed tonight for her son to make it home, just as my mother surely prayed for me. For a moment, pity stirred inside me. Then I remembered the stories: Union pickets shot from the tree line, civilians harassed, loyalists driven from their homes, rumors of atrocities I tried not to believe. Pity softened into something else. Not anger. Not hate. Just resolve. I headed back to camp. Most of the men had finally drifted into uneasy sleep. Bodies lay scattered across blankets and bedrolls, curled like children seeking warmth. The fires had burned down to glowing coals. A few soldiers kept watch, silhouettes standing motionless against the trees. I lay beside Jones and pulled my coat tighter around me. The ground was cold, but exhaustion finally began dragging me down. As my eyes closed, I could still see the valley, the fires, the shadows, the waiting enemy. The last thing I heard before sleep claimed me was the sergeant's low voice addressing the night guards. "Keep your eyes open. At the first sign of light, everything changes." He was right. When the sun rose, the quiet of this night would shatter. When the sun rose, the road we'd marched would end in fire. When the sun rose, boys would become soldiers, or they wouldn't rise at all. Morning didn't come gently. It slammed into us with blinding light and suffocating heat, dragging us awake far earlier than any officer's shout could have. The sun rose like a burning coin over the treetops, casting long orange spears of light through the branches and turning the dew on our blankets into steam. Jones shook my shoulder. "Up. They're forming the line." I sat up slowly, every muscle stiff from sleeping on the hard ground. My mouth felt dry as old paper. All around me, men were pulling on their jackets, stamping their boots, tightening canteens and cartridge boxes. The camp transformed from a cluster of half-asleep bodies into an army with frightening speed. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. The day we had been marching toward was here. Soon we were moving, column after column of blue uniforms stretching down the dirt road, rifles glinting sharply in the early sun. At first, the march had a kind of energy to it. Officers rode along the flanks shouting orders. Drummers tapped out a confident rhythm. Some men even whistled or sang under their breath, trying to shake off the night's dread. But the farther we marched, the heavier the land felt. Trees grew sparse, giving way to open fields that shimmered with summer heat. Clouds of dust rose with every step, coating our uniforms and sticking to the sweat on our faces. The air smelled of dry earth, trampled grass, and the faintest trace of wood smoke coming from distant farms. I kept my eyes forward, but my thoughts drifted with every mile. I remembered leaving Washington, all the people lining the roads, cheering us as if we were heroes marching to certain victory. I remembered the way they waved flags, calling out promises of glory, urging us to teach the rebels a lesson, and finish this quickly. Their optimism had felt contagious then, filling my chest with something bright. Now, under the scorching morning sun, that same optimism felt thin, brittle, almost foolish. Private Hanley trudged beside me, his face already flushed red. "They said the rebels are just farmers," he muttered between breaths. Untrained. Under-equipped. Running scared. I wiped sweat from my brow. Farmers can't shoot straight. Yeah. He hesitated, swallowed hard. You think they'll run? I wanted to tell him yes. Wanted to reassure him the way older soldiers sometimes did. But then I remembered the Confederate campfires glowing steady and unafraid in the valley last night. I remembered the rumors, how their men drilled just as hard, how many had served in militias long before secession. So I just said, "We'll know soon enough." The road narrowed as we entered a small patch of woodland. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in shimmering green and gold. Cicadas screamed from every direction, so loud it felt like the trees themselves were vibrating. Horses snorted and tossed their heads. The heat claustrophobed the air into something thick and breathless. "Water!" someone shouted. "Save it!" an officer barked back. We pressed on. A small farmhouse appeared on a rise ahead, white paint peeling, windows shuttered. Laundry still hung stiff on a line near the porch. Not a soul in sight. No animals. No tools left in the yard. Abandoned in a hurry. A strange, hollow feeling settled in my stomach. Every mile carried the same signs: wagons left by the roadside, fields half-harvested, churches with their doors wide open as if the congregation had simply vanished. The land looked wounded before the battle even began. Around noon, the columns halted so the officers could adjust formation. Men collapsed onto the grass the moment they stopped moving. Some tore off their hats and fanned themselves desperately. Others loosened their belts and gulped from their nearly empty canteens. Jones stared toward the horizon, where smoke curled faintly into the sky. "You think that's them?" "Probably," I said. He nodded, jaw tight. "Then we're close. Closer than we wanted to be." Suddenly, a commotion rippled through the ranks. Someone pointed to the ridge ahead. A rider approached, Union cavalry, dust trailing behind him like a banner. He galloped straight to the officers, exchanged urgent words, then wheeled away and thundered down the line again. "Scouts spotted Confederate pickets near the creek," a sergeant shouted moments later. "We're pushing forward." A murmur swept through the men. The joking stopped. The complaining stopped. Even the heavy breathing quieted, replaced by something sharper. Electric. Terrifying. This was it. We rose, reformed the line, and marched on. The woods opened into a wide plain, rolling gently downhill toward a stream, Bull Run. Beyond it, low hills rose like sleeping beasts. Somewhere beyond those hills, the Confederate army waited. I could feel them, even if I couldn't see them. Every sound sharpened. The rustle of grass beneath our boots. The metallic clicking of ramrods and buckles. The distant call of a crow. The thud of my heartbeat pounding against my ribs. 1 mile out, we passed a farmstead that had not been entirely deserted. 2 old men and a woman stood near their barn, watching us with expressions I couldn't read. Fear? Resentment? Grief? Or maybe all three. One of the older men lifted a hand in a hesitant wave. I nodded back, unsure what else to do. "Think they're Union?" Hanley whispered. "Hard to say. War didn't give people time to declare their loyalties. It just forced them to pick one." The road sloped gently downward toward the creek. The air grew hotter, thicker. Sweat soaked through my shirt. My legs burned from the march, but I didn't dare slow. No one did. Every man had the same fear gnawing at him. When the shooting starts, don't be the one caught unready. We were less than half a mile from the creek when the first real sign of the enemy appeared. A single rider, gray uniform, cresting a distant ridge for just a moment. He paused, silhouetted against the blinding blue sky. Then he vanished. A scout. A messenger. The Confederates knew we were coming. An uneasy shiver ran through the entire column. This wasn't a parade anymore. This wasn't practice or posturing. This was war, waiting just around the bend. And as we marched, the land itself seemed to sense it. The trees grew still. The breeze died. Even the birds fell silent, as if the whole world had leaned in to watch. I gripped my rifle tighter. Somewhere ahead, I couldn't say exactly when the march ended that day. The road blurred into something shapeless: dust, heat, footsteps, and the low murmur of 1,000 tired men trying not to think too far ahead. The sky had faded from the bruised blue of late afternoon into a pale, washed-out gold, the kind that makes every hill look like it's holding its breath. Even the birds seemed to quiet down as the sun slid lower, as if they sensed what we were walking toward. We eventually halted near a cluster of fields dotted with half-rotted fence posts, and a handful of deserted farm buildings leaning tiredly against the horizon. Someone said we were only a few miles from Centerville. Someone else said we were closer to the enemy than command wanted us to know. Rumors came and went like mosquitoes, constant, irritating, and impossible to sweat. When I finally tore my pack from my shoulders, I felt a ripple of relief run through my spine, sharp enough to make me shiver. The field grass was tall, brushing my knees like cold fingers, whispering in the rising evening wind. The scent of clover mixed with wood smoke from the campfires springing to life around us, soft orange circles in the deepening dusk. Men dropped wherever they stood, some collapsing onto bedrolls, others onto bare earth. A few still tried to joke, but even their laughter sounded strained, thin, stretched, almost fragile. I found a spot beneath the crooked frame of a willow tree and sat there with my canteen in my hands, rolling it slowly between my palms. My fingers felt stiff, swollen from the march. My throat burned from dust. My legs trembled each time I shifted my weight. It wasn't exhaustion alone that made me shake, it was the quiet that settled over the camp as night deepened, the kind of quiet that blankets everything and leaves your mind too free, too open. From where I sat, I could see the glow of Washington far behind us, faint now, barely a smudge of warm light against the edge of the sky. It felt impossibly distant, as if weeks, not days, had passed since we'd left. The city had always seemed permanent, solid, reassuring in its noise and order. But from out here, with the land stretching wide and uncertain, Washington seemed like something delicate, almost breakable. Something we were responsible for protecting, whether we were ready or not. Wilkes stopped beside me, hands on his hips, breathing hard. His uniform was streaked with dust, the cuffs dark with sweat. He didn't say anything at first. He just lowered himself to the ground with a quiet grunt and stared out at the horizon with me. "Hard to believe," he finally murmured, "that in a few hours' march, the world might look completely different." I nodded, though I didn't trust my voice enough to answer. The wind tugged at the willow branches above us, making them sway like slow-moving shadows. Fireflies blinked in and out of existence just beyond the tree-line, drifting lazily as if they had no idea men were preparing to kill each other come morning. Somewhere in the camp, a drummer practiced softly, the taps muffled, hesitant, more like breathing than music. The rhythm faded into the murmur of soldiers settling down for the night, into the crackle of burning wood, into the shifting rustle of gear being checked and rechecked for the 10th time. Even those who said they weren't nervous moved with the restless energy of men standing on the edge of something vast and irreversible. As darkness thickened, the officers' tents glowed faintly, silhouettes moving inside like figures trapped in lantern glass. Orders were being written, maps studied, decisions made. And yet, for all the command and certainty we were meant to trust in, I could feel the uncertainty pulsing through the ranks like a second heartbeat. I leaned back against the tree trunk. The bark pressed rough against my shoulders. My eyes wandered over the starless sky, thick clouds gathering overhead, heavy and slow. It looked like the kind of night that wrapped itself around you, close and suffocating, holding its secrets tight. "When do you think it'll start?" I finally asked Wilkes, my voice barely above a whisper. He sighed. "Dawn, most likely. Battles like to begin with the light, makes it easier to see what you're doing." The way he said it, flat, resigned, sent a hollow ache through my chest. Dawn. A single word, simple and small, yet suddenly enormous. Dawn meant marching again. Dawn meant muskets raised, cannons unlimbered, the long green fields of Virginia echoing with the kind of thunder no man forgets. Dawn meant the first real test of everything we'd trained for, everything we'd feared. I watched a column of smoke drift upward from a dying campfire, curling into the darkness like a question no one wanted to answer. The men around me began settling into uneasy sleep, though I doubted many actually rested. Some wrote letters home, silhouettes hunched over paper, their faces dimly lit by lanterns. Others held their rifles across their knees like talismans. A group near the far edge of the field knelt in a quiet circle, murmuring prayers that rose and fell like the tide. I wondered if I should join them. I wondered if it would make any difference. After a while, Wilkes rose, slapped the dust from his trouser legs, and gave me a look that managed to be both stern and strangely gentle. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow's going to come whether we're ready or not." He walked off into the dim glow of the campfires, leaving me alone with the night and the weight of his words. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My hands trembled again, this time not from fatigue. Tomorrow. I closed my eyes. I tried to imagine what the morning would bring. I tried not to imagine what it might take away. When I finally lay down on my blanket, the earth felt cold beneath me. The air smelled of smoke and damp soil. The willow branches above me whispered like anxious voices. And as I stared into the darkness, waiting for sleep that didn't come, I felt it, the sense that everything we'd known before this night was already slipping behind us, fading like the last light over Washington. Tomorrow would change us. Tomorrow would test us. Tomorrow, on the road to Bull Run, we would learn what kind of soldiers we truly were, and what kind of men we might become before the sun set again.